So in the last episode, we looked at what is Azure Arc and the two pillars of Azure Arc. One is the Azure Arc enabled infrastructure. The other is the Azure Arc enabled services. Now in this episode, we're going to look at under the Azure Arc enabled infrastructure, what is Azure Arc for servers? Hi and welcome back for yet another episode on Jayant on Cloud. Thanks for tuning in again. My name is Jayant. I work as a Senior Principal Engineering Technologist at Dell Technologies. And thank you for all the subscription, the likes, comments. If you have not already subscribed, please hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified as and when I upload new videos. So in this episode, we're going to look at the Azure Arc for servers. So without wasting much time, let's get cracking with live demos. All right, so here I am in Windows Admin Center. So now let's click on this because I've already created a cluster. So let's click on the Azure Stack HCI clusters. All right, so let's wait for it to load. It does take quite a bit. Should come up in a minute. Okay, all right, so it's already here. All right, so I've already created a cluster out of this. So if you look at the nodes of the cluster, there are a couple of nodes, which is the Azure Stack HCI 1 and Azure Stack HCI 2. Okay, and they're already registered against an Azure subscription. As you can see, this cluster is registered here. It's connected. So if I go into portal.azure.com, boom, go into Azure Stack HCI resource, there's a cluster that says JY, AZS HCI clue. If I click on that, you will see the two nodes here, the Azure Stack HCI 1 and the Azure Stack HCI 2. So it's a two-node Azure Stack HCI cluster which we have created. Okay. All right. So what I've done is basically went ahead and spun up few virtual machines. Now let's go to virtual machines here. Okay. All right. So let's wait for it to come up. All right. So now you see two virtual machines, which is the Windows Server 2019 and the Windows Server 2022. Now these are the virtual machines which I've spun up on the Azure Stack HCI 2 node clusters. Okay. Now, what I will do is, so what I've done basically is I have surfaced these virtual machines into Azure Control. Okay. So how I've done that? So basically, what I've done is I went into Azure Arc. Let's go to Azure Arc, and then under infrastructure, right? There is an option to onboard servers which reside outside of Azure. Okay, so let's click on add. So now there are two ways to do it. So one is add a single server at a time, or you can also add multiple servers. So I'll come back to the option of adding multiple servers. So for now, let's get into adding a single server at a time. So click on I need to generate a script, right? So basically, all I need to do is prerequisites. Basically, I should have an HTTP access to Azure services, which basically means that from the virtual machine, there should be a port 443 enabled, which is an outgoing connection from that virtual machine. It's an outbound URL. So it should be able to reach Azure through HTTP request. Okay. Then I click on next. So it presents me with the subscription, which I'm currently under, and then basically the resource group, which I want to kind of manage all of these onboarded servers under, and I can choose the region that I'm operating. So typically in my case, I would select Southeast Asia, and the operating system that I'm trying to onboard. So remember, there are two Windows operating systems which I'm trying to onboard. So and hence, I would select Windows, right? And connectivity method, it's a public endpoint. So if I have a proxy server which is set up, which the virtual machines need to go through, then I will specify the proxy server endpoint as well. Okay. Then I click on next. Then I provide the tagging. So in my case, generally I provide, this could be your own custom tagging, right? Typical Azure tagging that you're familiar with. So in my case, I've actually created Azure Arc for servers. So I'll select that and go next. So now I need to download this script. Okay. So either I can just click on the copy. So as you can see here, right? So it basically does a couple of things. When I actually run this PowerShell command, it downloads the Azure onboard agent, which you will see soon, and also registers this server to this Azure subscription. So we'll see how that happens. Okay, so I've launched the Hyper-V Manager console, and I've added the 2 nodes of these clusters under the Hyper-V Manager. So remember, it's just my preferred choice of managing these nodes and then opening up the console to the VMs that I've actually deployed. But it's up to you. You can use Windows Admin Center as well, or you can simply do a remote desktop from the management system that actually has connectivity to that particular VM, right? All right, so I've opened a console to it. So let's go into this console. So this is the Windows Server 2019 is actually hosted on the first node, which is the Azure Stack HCI one. Okay. So what I did is I went ahead and copied that part of the script that we saw here, this one, into a notepad called script. Okay. Now let's copy this. Okay. So remember, you can simply run this, right? Now, I don't want to run this here because it's already installed with the onboarding agent. But if I run it again, it'll say it's already onboarded, right? The only difference that you see here, let's say if you have to do this, is that let's say the system is absolutely new and no onboarding agent is deployed, then you would get an option to log into using device login, where you're presented to onboard that system into Azure. So which means you have to basically browse through, let's say, Edge. There's a code it generates, so you need to basically present that code here. So it's Microsoft. So you'll see. Microsoft.com/login. Okay, so this is the URL, and if you just click on this URL, okay, so there is a code that it generates. So this particular script generates a code so that you can use that code to onboard that system into public Azure. Okay, so once that is done, it will prompt you saying all the server has been successfully onboarded into Azure. And once it is onboarded, you can go back to here, go to Azure Arc, and go to servers. Okay, so you will see that, for instance, in this particular case, let's go to the server here. Right, so let's wait for it to load. Apologies for the background noise here. Unfortunately, I live on the main road, so there's a lot of noise I try and avoid, but still, sometimes it's impossible to avoid the background noise. Sorry about that. But if you see the computer name here for the Windows Server 2019, it says JY Azure Stack HCI Clue-W2K9 is a server that we were trying to onboard, right? Now, so this is, as you can see, successfully, once the server has been successfully onboarded, the server that shows up here, okay? And if you click on that server, it takes a while. It takes about a couple of, few minutes to kind of, successfully onboard. And you see, this server has all the Azure constructs that you can imagine, right? the likes of the Azure tagging, the Azure logs, extension, properties, securities, and we'll see how you can actually manage this server from an Azure control plane a little while later. So likewise, I've also onboarded another server, which is the, if I go to virtual machines here, which is the Windows Server 2022. Even that server has been onboarded. Now, one of the things to remember, right? So it does install an onboarding agent here. So if I go into, let's say, programs that are installed there, okay. Programs. Okay, you see this Azure Connected Machine Agent. So this is an agent that is responsible to onboard an on-premises server into public Azure. Okay, so we'll come back to the other agents that are already here at a later point of time, not in the context of this episode, but for now, just this is an agent that is responsible to onboard a server into Azure. So, like I said, just like how I've onboarded the Windows Server 2019, I've also onboarded the Windows Server 2022. So that you can see, there's a Windows Server 2022, which is already part of, which is already onboarded to Azure using Azure Arc. Okay. One other thing that I want to show you is, I have also created a console in Google Cloud platform. So if I log into console.cloud.google.com and go into compute engines and say VM instances. Okay. So there are 3 VMs that are running today. The one VM that I've actually tried to onboard is called GCP-open. Okay. Now if I click on that, right, so it gives me all the details about that VM, the IP addresses, the name, all that information is available here. Okay. So now if I quickly go okay. Now this server has been similarly onboarded, just like this is an Ubuntu system. Okay, so there are different ways to onboard this system. For example, even the one that we onboarded is a Windows server. So just like that, there is a script that it generates, which is a shell script in this case, which I need to come into the to the Linux console and execute that script. Right? So just like that, for instance, if I click on add servers and generate a script, the same function, but the only difference is the operating system. Okay, so let's select Azure Arc, that's the resource group, select Southeast Asia, the region that I'm closer to, and in this case, I will select Linux. Okay, select the public endpoint. Tagging, the necessary tagging which you're supposed to do. It's always good practice to tag each of the resources, that way it's easier to filter those resources in Azure. Like you see, this is a shell script which I'm supposed to run, opening an SSH command. So you can just do an SSH to the Linux virtual, which is the Ubuntu virtual machine, which is deployed in GCP, and use PuTTY. PuTTY is a natural choice that I use generally for doing an SSH. So you can use PuTTY and then SSH it into that Ubuntu virtual machine and execute the script, right? As soon as you execute the script and you come back here, okay, just like how we onboarded the Windows Server 2019 and Windows Server 2022, even the Ubuntu virtual machine shows up here as a VM under Azure Arc, right? So it says the manufacturer is Google, cloud provider is GCP, and all of that information, right? So it's so seamless, so beautiful, right? You can just simply onboard irrespective of where these virtual machines reside. I've seen 2 different locations. One, 2 Windows virtual machines residing on Azure Stack and CI clusters, and 1 virtual machine which is residing in Google Cloud Platform. Okay. Now, there are different ways to onboard your service as well, like we discussed, right? So if I go into Azure Arc, go to infrastructure and go to add service, The other way to add it is through multiple servers. So what if you have a huge estate of virtual machines which are residing outside, which are living outside of Azure, right? If you have to do, one by one, it's going to take months together, right? So there is easier way to do it, which is basically you can go ahead and create a service principal. So which means you won't be prompted for you to punch in that code, which you need to put it into Microsoft.com/device login manually. So instead, you can just use service principal in Azure Arc, which gives you just enough access to onboard this agent, to deploy this agent and onboard the service that you're deploying, that are living outside of Azure. Okay, so let's see how that is done. Okay, so similar thing. So get into select the resource group, select the region that you want to onboard the server to, and whether it's a Windows or Linux platform that you want to do, and then click on next. So the only difference here is the service principal. Okay, so you need to create the corresponding service principal in order to do that. So in my case, I've actually created a service principal called multiple principal. Okay, I'll show you how to create that service principal. And once you select the service principal that you have created, click next. And the usual process of tagging. Like I said, it's always a good practice to tag the service. That's it. And this is going to generate this, another script, but this is based on the service principal. Okay, but remember here, you need to provide the secret, which is very important. And when you create a secret, so when you create the service principal for the first time, it is going to give you, as soon as you create the successful creation of that service principal, you need to copy that secret, immediately. Failing which you may not be able to retrieve that secret again, right? So it's very important that you make a note of that secret. So that is a secret actually you put it here, and you run this script. So we'll come back to how to run this script, especially when you have many virtual machines which are living outside of Azure. We'll come back to that later. But let's first look at how to create that service principal. So if you go into Azure Arc, there is, if I go into service principals, okay? Now, just click on add. So for example, the one that we saw, multiple machine MC principal. So just like that, you can just go ahead and create a service principal of your choice. Okay. So as soon as you create the service principal, it generates the secret, and make sure that you make a note of the client ID and also the secret. Right. You can just store it on a notepad, and then you can copy paste that into that script and run that script. Now coming back to the question of how do you run this when, let's say, you have thousands of virtual machines which are running outside of Azure, right? You can't run this, in each and every system, right? So as part of the practice, so one of the things that you can do is Microsoft has given best practices to onboard, virtual machines at scale, which is hybrid machines at scale. Different options that you can use using the service principal. Either you can use, configuration manager, right, which is a system center configuration manager, or you can use a task sequence under system center configuration. So what you can do is you can actually copy this script, right, create a task sequence in system center configuration manager, and as part of the deployment of the operating system. Remember, system center configuration manager is used for doing a mass deployment of the operating systems. So you can use that, and as part of the deployment as a last step, right? Once the OS is deployed, as a last step in the task sequence, you can actually upload the script, right? So which is the script that we created using the service principal with the secret service principal secret. Upload that script, add that as part of this task sequence. So when that task sequence runs, it also executes that script as part of the deployment workflow, right? So then automatically, as part of the deployment, that particular virtual machine would show up under Azure Arc. Like I said, if you use the service principal method, it does not ask you to do a device login like we saw in one-to-one server onboarding method that we saw. If you use the service principal, there is no prompt to add this manually. Okay, it'll be automatically added to Azure using the one-to-many or onboarding many servers, right? Methodology. So, like I said, there are different options that Microsoft has provided. I would say feel free to take a look at this document. It depends on how your organization would have zeroed in on the deployment methodologies. You could be using your own, for example, you may be using Ansible playbooks, for instance, right? For deploying, large-scale operating system deployments, or it could be using System Center Configuration Manager for doing mass-scale deployments. So it really depends on how your organization is, standardized on your deployment methodologies. But the best part is, it's just a script. You can just configure that script or add that script as part of the deployment, and it should get onboarded easily. All right, so with that, I've come to the end of this episode. So just to summarize, in this episode, we looked at how to onboard the servers that reside outside of Azure. We also saw different types of onboarding servers. How do you onboard a single server at a time, and how do you onboard multiple servers using Azure Arc or service principals into Azure, right? So in the next episode, we will look at what do we do after onboarding these servers, right? So how do you tie in Azure constructs to it, right? So let's look at all the possibilities that we can take, that are available from Azure Arc perspective on how to manage these servers. Please leave your valuable feedbacks, comments, and critics in the comment section. In my next episode, we will delve deeper into managing of Arc servers. And until then, stay tuned and stay safe.